Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Zachary Taylor, and the focus is to the White House. The year is 1849, and Taylor, now 64 years old, been in the military for the United States for nearly 4 decades, but now he is President-elect of the United States. So he's wrapping up his personal responsibilities in his home in Louisiana, getting set for his small contingent to move to Washington, D.C. Now, his wife, Peggy, would be certainly coming along, but she would be ill for most of his presidency, actually spend most of her time in her upstairs bedroom. Really, the only time she came out would be to go across the street to the nearby St. John's Church, which she frequented on a regular basis, but mostly she was unable, because of her illnesses, to perform most of the duties of First Lady, and so that would fall on Taylor's daughter, Betty. She performed those duties, and her husband would serve as Taylor's principal secretary, William Bliss. He called him Perfect Bliss, had been his companion since his military days, so this was the family affair that was moving into the White House. The outgoing President James Polk threw a dinner party for Taylor as he welcomed him. Still could not believe this is the man that was replacing him as President of the United States. Polk confided in his diary that General Taylor is, I have no doubt, a well-meaning old man. He is, however, uneducated, exceedingly ignorant of public affairs, and I should judge a very ordinary capacity. Neither here nor there. Polk was on his way out, Taylor on his way in. Polk got an extra day, in effect, because March 4th, Inauguration Day, fell on a Sunday, so the ceremonies were moved to the next day, Monday, on March the 5th, about 20,000 people on hand. Chief Justice Roger Taney swore in Zachary Taylor to the presidency, who then gave his inaugural address. Kind of a bland address, fairly deferential, in fact, to Congress, in which part of which he said at the time, it is for the wisdom of Congress itself, in which all legislative powers are vested by the Constitution, to regulate these and other matters of domestic policy. I shall look with confidence to the enlightened patriotism of that body to adopt such measures of conciliation as may harmonize conflicting interests and tend to perpetuate that union which should be the paramount object of our hopes and affections. Perpetuate the union. Above everything else, this was the marching orders for Zachary Taylor in what was going to be tense times during his presidency. Well, one of the first things the president has to do is to pick a cabinet, and actually Taylor got denied by the man he wanted at the top of the cabinet as Secretary of State, John Crittenden, who had been so helpful to him during his campaign to the presidency. But Crittenden had just been elected by the people of Kentucky to be their governor. He thought he owed it to them to deliver on that election, and so he declined Secretary of State. Instead, Taylor went with John Clayton of Delaware for the top spot in the cabinet. But by and large, it was a lackluster cabinet, not very experienced, but it did include a new position. Secretary of the Interior had been created, responsible for patents and pensions and public lands and Indian affairs, and the first Secretary of the Interior under Zachary Taylor was Thomas Ewing of Ohio. Well, he kind of expected to use his cabinet like a council of war. This is what he was used to, having his officers come together in the military to give him advice. He was planning to do the same as the President of the United States. They would come together on all the major issues. He would make the decisions, but then he would leave it up to his subordinates to go and actually execute those decisions. There would be very little micromanagement from this particular commander-in-chief, very different from his predecessor, James Polk. He was going to be a different kind of president on almost every scale. First of all, again, he had no political experience, even unlike the other 3 generals from the Army who had become President of the United States, George Washington, Andrew Jackson, William Henry Harrison. They all had strong political backgrounds. Not so Zachary Taylor. And in fact, he was barely recognized when he was walking the streets of Washington in the early days of his presidency, and even his demeanor was something that people were going to have to get used to. One observer said early in his presidency that the president mingles with the crowd in the most familiar manner. He has no personal attendants to stand between him and the people. Congressman Horace Mann actually took things to another level of degree in terms of his description of the president. He said he really is a most simple-minded old man. He has the least show or pretension about him of any man I ever saw. He talks as artlessly as a child about affairs of state, who does not seem to pretend to a knowledge of anything of which he is ignorant. He is a remarkable man in some respects, and it is remarkable that such a man should be President of the United States. Actually, probably well said. Well, Taylor was planning to focus on the big issues, and there were big issues for his presidency, mostly stemming from the outcome of the recent victory in the Mexican-American War, the cession of hundreds of thousands of square miles, and the question at hand, governance and expansion of slavery. Well, the governance was still in the hands of the U.S. military in most of these new lands that the U.S. had acquired. And while Taylor had stated his deference to Congress in his inaugural regarding domestic affairs, on this topic, he frankly did not trust the Congress because it was a completely political body, and he didn't want these fights about slavery to being all about politics. He actually had an idea to take the issue of slavery expansion out of the hands of Congress and actually just put it into those areas that were about to come into the United States or had recently come in. The question would be, would they come in as territories or would they come in as states? If they came in as territories, then Congress would have oversight. If they came in directly as states, as Texas had recently done, then the locals would decide things like the issue of slavery, and it would be taken out of the hands of the politicians in Washington, D.C. In fact, he wanted California and the large area of New Mexico to come into the United States as states for this very reason. In fact, he dispatched Georgia Congressman T. Butler King with a message for the people of California. And this came through the Secretary of State, John Clayton, that said, sincere desire of the executive to protect the citizens of California in the formation of any government, Republican in its character, hereafter to be submitted to Congress, which shall be the result of their deliberate choice. The plan of such a government, state or territorial, free or slave, must originate with themselves and without the interference of the executive, and as far as Zachary Taylor was concerned, perhaps without the interference of Congress, that political body that had so much angst on this topic already. Well, California was ready. California was ready to apply for statehood. New Mexico was not. They balked at this similar entreaty that they got from the executive. They were planning to seek territorial status initially. Well, Congress was in recess that much of this period, most of 1849. They were not in Washington, so gave the opportunity for Taylor to focus a bit on foreign affairs, the area of his responsibilities that fell really squarely within the office of the executive, unlike domestic affairs, which he had alluded to giving more deference to the people in the United States Congress. There were not big issues necessarily going on in foreign affairs, but a few that Taylor did address. There were some claims against Portugal that he had to resolve. There were some challenges with the French foreign minister that used up some of his time. He did express some sympathy for the revolutionaries in Hungary, and he confirmed neutrality for the United States with respect to a recent uprising in Cuba. But the one main topic that actually did catch his attention quite a bit was the possibility of building a canal through Central America to connect the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, bring benefits in the areas of trade and travel and the military as well. And the focus of these negotiations for the Americans was in the country of Nicaragua. They even came to an agreement that the U.S. would build the canal, the Nicaraguans would still own the land, but the canal itself would be open to all. This was a real progress for Zachary Taylor, but there was one problem, and that problem was Great Britain. Great Britain had interests in the area. In fact, they had established a protectorate over the so-called Mosquito people who lived in this coveted regional part of Nicaragua. And the Great Britain and the Mosquito people were objecting to this treaty to build this canal. There were some testy exchanges in this period going on between the United States and Great Britain on who had the rights over what in terms of their agreement with Nicaragua, as the British and their agreement with the Mosquito people. Well, they worked it out and they finally came to an agreement and they signed a treaty. They called it the Cayton-Bulwer Treaty, and Zachary Taylor was happy to put his signature on it and send it off to the Senate for approval, which it was approved. But all of this was kind of speaking too soon because unfortunately the language in this treaty was not crafted very well. It was vague on a couple of really important points, and this treaty would be nothing but a problem for the United States and Great Britain for decades. They would argue about what was actually in it, and ultimately no canal would ever be built across Nicaragua. In the end, all of this was pretty minor compared to the major cleavage of the day, which was going to come to the fore as Congress returned to Washington. This was all about the Mexican cession, governance, and the expansion of slavery, and that is the story for another day. That is Zachary Taylor and To the White House, from the life of Zachary Taylor. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.